Hello, beautiful people. What's up? What's up? What's up, y'all? I'm super excited to be here. Welcome to Just Talk. I am Danae. If y'all see the topic, um, grief, the fear tactic. I am so excited to be sharing and having a conversation um, about this because this is something that has heavily affected my life for quite some time now. So, grief is a fear tactic. So, um, first off, to those who are returning, thank you for coming back. And to the newcomers, the people who are new here, welcome. If you have not already, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you leave a comment below and let me know what you think about this type of content. Um, and you share for those who you believe may need to hear this conversation that we're getting ready to have. So, uh, if you see me keep looking back and forth, I'm actually live on YouTube and on Facebook. So, um, you're going to be seeing me look back and forth a bit, but I'm not ignoring you. Just FYI. So yes, so grief belongs not in the hands of control. And I'll say that again. Grief belongs not in the hands of control. A lot of the times, when we are grieving, we try to control how we grieve, or we try to control how others grieve. We try to control the process of stages and the different ways that we grieve through different things. And so, if you missed the conversation last Wednesday, or the Wednesday, the 1st of November, I had a conversation about grief and what grief is. The grief of detachment was the topic of discussion. And we talked a bit about in the video about how um, we talked a bit in the video about how um, the hardships that comes with grief and detaching, or the grief that comes with detachment, having to release or remove yourself from um, people, places, or things that are no longer serving you, that are no longer working for you. And that's a conversation as well that I feel like not enough people are having, just about how we grieve the loss of things, even though those things are no longer good or well for us. We still go through a grieving process of having to um, release and let those things go. And so I think it's important for us to begin to start having these conversations about grief, what grief looks like, how it looks on different people, because grief is not going to look the same from one person to the next. And grief is also not going to look the same on the same person in different experiences. So, the grieving experience you may have from losing a parent completely different than the grieving experience you may have from losing a child or a friend or a partner, right, or significant other in your life. And so understanding, those different components, it's so vital and it's so important, it's so crucial. And so today we're going to be talking about grief, the fear tactic. And so understanding that grief is oftentimes or the fear tactic of grief is oftentimes brought up through guilt, by way of guilt. Many times when we lose a significant other, or if we lose our jobs, or we get into a car accident and our car is totaled, or we lose money, or whatever the thing is that we lost, right, and we're grieving the loss of, we tend to carry some type of guilt, especially if we don't affirm certain things for ourselves and help ourselves understand and know the truth of a thing. And so um, what ends up happening is we end up carrying around that grief. And what happens is that grief becomes, we end up carrying around that guilt, and that guilt becomes a weapon that is then used against us, whether we consciously recognize it or not. That guilt is then used as a weapon, and it's often um, used as a way to fear us into or out of certain things. Um, and so, what is grief? In a nutshell, grief is the adjustment period. And this is my own personal definition, so this is not something that came out of Webster's dictionary, right? But in a nutshell, grief is the adjustment period of loss. So it's the period where you are adjusting from what life used to be to what life now is, adjusting to your new normal state of being. Where you are no longer married. You may go from married to divorce, or you may go from marriage to divorce, or you may go from single to married, or you may go from no kids to children, or you may go from being a full-time parent college and is a young adult now. And so all of those things typically, grief is simply put the adjustment period. Grief is the adjustment period of loss. And so when you think about grief from that perspective, it becomes a lot less scary. Many people are afraid of grief, because we've been taught to fear it. We've been taught to fear it. We've been taught to be afraid of it. We've been taught to neglect it and reject it and push away from it, because it makes us feel these things that we don't typically know or understand how to feel. Many of us have not been taught or told or helped to understand what our feelings are, or how to process our feelings, right? And so all of these things, all these little nuggets, right, that we were never taught how to do, tends to lead to us carrying guilt around that then becomes a trigger. And that trigger is often a button that is pressed. And so um, I want to share with you the 5 stages of grief. So there's 5 common stages of grief. And so the first stage is denial. So when something happens, typically the first thing we do is deny it. When you find out someone that you love has passed on, right? They've transitioned. The first thing you do is think, ain't no way. You lying. Stop playing, right? First thing you say or think to yourself is, no, that ain't true. That ain't real. Ain't no way. I just finished talking to her. I was just talking to him. I just saw him yesterday. I just got off the phone with him an hour ago. No, right? The first stage is denial. You immediately deny what's going on. And then the second stage is anger, right? You're mad at yourself, right? You're mad at them for leaving you. You're mad at yourself for not seeing the signs. You're mad, you're angry because you feel like, you know, this should not have happened, right? And then you have the bargaining phase. The bargaining phase is when you that's what I like to call the shoulda coulda woulda phase. And it's like when you're in your head about, I should have done this. If I would have stayed with her a little longer, she probably wouldn't have gotten into that bad car accident, or she wouldn't have gotten robbed and killed, or if I would have just stayed on the phone with him, that wouldn't have happened, or I would have known to call the police, or this, right? And so we go into this shoulda coulda woulda phase of, if I would have done this, then things would have turned out differently. um but that's just not the case, right? But that is the bargaining phase. And then you have depression. That is the phase where it tends to sink in, right? And it tends to hit you in ways left and right, and in this uncontrollable way, right? And then you have the fifth stage is acceptance. This is the stage where you finally start to come to terms with the new normal or the new reality of your life, um, without that person or without that thing, terms, and learn to accept whatever it was that has happened. Whether it was a loss of a job, the loss of a loved one, money, a house, whatever it was, right? And so those are the stages of grief. And so whenever we don't allow ourselves to go through the stages of grief, we tend to um, carry, as I said, guilt. And so the guilt is what leads to the fear tactic, right? If you ever heard anybody say something like, and so I'll actually share a bit of my story. So about 10 years ago, God informed me to remove myself from my family. And so anybody who knows me knows that I am a very family oriented person. I love my family. I cannot imagine life without my family. And so, or I could not imagine life without my family, those that I grew up with. I could not imagine life without them. And so, um, I couldn't imagine life without them. And so I literally ignored God's wishes. I ignored what God told me to do. And so for the past 10 years or so, I ended up going through things that I shouldn't have had to go through. And every time I got to a point to where I was fed up and I was done and I was just ready to call it a quits and wash my hands of everything, something would happen that would almost guilt me into um it would guilt me into um, going backwards, right? And so, for example, um, I had a conversation with someone before, um, and I was just telling him like how, my mom has schizophrenia, and I was like, it makes it very hard to have a relationship with her. I was like, I love my mother. It's like, but she is battling with some things that I can't get personally entangled with. And I remember the first thing the man said to me was, he said, but that's your mother, and you only get one. That is a classic example of the fear tactic, right? And then he said something about, and what if she dies tomorrow? And I remember telling him, I said, then she'll just be dead, and not that I wish death upon anyone, but we often use death, right? The grief that comes from death as a fear tactic to try to sway people into doing things. And he was like, so what if your family dies? And I was like, they'll just be dead. I'll go to their funeral and, I'll see them through. Um, and he was so shocked by my response. I think most of us are so used to giving in or giving way to that fear tactic that we don't realize that we're even doing it when we're doing it. Um, and so when he said that, and I told him, I'll see them through their transition, and I'll of course grieve their loss because I love them, but it's like one rule of thumb. I learned this. I actually had to learn this lesson the hard way, but a few years ago, I lost someone very close to me, and it was like I carried grief around with me for a very long time, or guilt around with me for a very long time, and as a result, um, or the grief was a result of, or the guilt was because I sincerely, I felt like it was things that I could have and should have said and done differently at the time, and so I carried that guilt around with me. And so that lesson of his sudden passing taught me that I need to make sure that I always say what needs to be said and do what I need to do in the moment, and don't push it off and don't wait until the next day or the next moment. And so um, what happened was, I finally got to a place of where I let that go, right? And so now I have a natural rule of thumb where I leave all relationships with, I start relationships and I leave them with peace and love. And so if there's ever anything that needs to be said or done, I lead and leave those things with peace and love. And um I don't allow the guilt to eat me up inside anymore, right? And so that way, if something were to have suddenly if something were to have suddenly happened, right, to a person that I love or to a thing that I love, I know that I appreciated that person or that relationship or that thing, with everything that I could appreciate and show gratitude to it for, that when or if it does transition or leave me and I never get to see it or experience it again, I know that I led with peace and love, and I finished with peace and love. And there's so many of us who don't, so many times we don't say what needs to be said or do what needs to be done, that we feel this sense of guilt. Um, we feel this sense of guilt. And so when people get to a consciousness where you learn how to say what needs to be said and do what needs to be done, um, it trips people out when they say, but that's your mother and I love her, or that's your father and I love him, right? And just having to realize like that you can't use that guilt trip, you can't use that fear tactic, right? And so fear, as we know it, is false evidence appearing real. And so if so, a lot of us are still underneath that cloak, that spell, that belief, that mindset, that thought process that people who are grieving get to say whatever they want to say, do whatever they want to do, right? And so back to um me 10 years ago, like when God told me to remove myself from my family, one of the things that ate me up again was guilt. Like I didn't want to leave my family behind. Like I didn't want to feel like I was um I was failing them. Um I didn't want to feel like I wasn't a good sister or daughter or aunt or friend, whoever the people were that God was telling me to leave behind. I didn't want to feel like a bad anything. And so I allowed that guilt to eat me up and it kept drawing me back in. And so that fear tactic was very much alive in my life, for so many years. And I was like, I'm afraid I don't want to leave this person and I don't want that. And so that it became fear. It became this constant fear of me being afraid to do things because I didn't want my relationship with those people to end. I didn't want my relationship with those. I didn't want to seem like a failure. I didn't want to seem like I wasn't good enough. I didn't want them to think, the worst of me, right? I didn't want any of that. So I stayed in those relationships. And so that fear tactic became a part of how I made decisions, how I moved, who I was slowly but surely becoming without even recognizing it. And so the fear tactic is a very heavy thing that many of us experience without even recognizing it. So if you've heard someone say something like, you only get one, right? You only get one mother, you only get one father, you only get that one sister. Like you'll never get another sister like her, never get a right. You'll never have another child that'll be like her or him. You'll never get another, right? And so that's people trying to guilt trip you um into doing something. And so, for example, if you were to say get into an argument with your mother, and or you had a disagreement with your mother, and y'all just were not seeing eye to eye, y'all are bumping heads on a particular subject, and you had a conversation with one of your friends, and the first thing they say to you, well, you got to make that right because that's your mother. That's a guilt trip, right? And so that's the fear tactic. Um, that's a guilt trip. That's a fear tactic being used upon you, right? And then so they give you their sob story about how, I lost my mother at 9. I'd give anything if I could talk to my mother right now, right? But the fact of the matter is, you wouldn't know what your relationship with your mother would be like right now if your mother was still alive. You sincerely do not know because your mother passed at 9. So you cannot compare your 9-year-old relationship with your mother to my 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old relationship with my mother, right? And so what happens is we tend to live in the past with things, and then we try to compare it to the present moment. And then when it doesn't relate, we use that as a fear tactic. And so if you ever hear someone saying things like, you only get one, or, that's your mother, or, what if they die tomorrow? Those are words, phrases, things that people say that is a clear sign of a fear tactic. There's a complete difference between a person who uses um, there's a complete difference between a person who uses their story, who tells their story and allows their story to motivate and to inspire people, versus a person who tries to use their story as a way to try to manipulate or control people into making particular decisions. So if I was to tell or share my story and it motivated you or inspired you to make different decisions in your life, that is all I can ask of my story to do, right? But if I try to tell my story in a way to say, because, I shared my story, you have to now make different decisions, or you have to now change yourself or change who you are, that is control and manipulation. And as I said at the beginning of this video, um, grief belongs not in the hands of control. Grief belongs not in the hands of control. And so when we learn to release control from our grief and stop trying to control how we grieve and how other people grieve, we'll be able to clearly see when or if the fear tactic is either being used upon us, or when we're trying to use a fear tactic on other people. And so fear is, again, false evidence appearing real. And so if you are a person who is making decisions out of fear, then you are likely being motivated or manipulated by the fear tactic commonly associated with grief. And um, and I feel like we should start having more conversations. I feel like we should start having more conversations about uh, grief, the fear tactic. And I hope this conversation has been insightful for you. Um, so if you are either using grief, the fear tactic, or it's being used upon you, I encourage you to ask yourself, in what ways or for what reasons may I be trying to um, use control as a way to live my life, right? What in what ways do I not feel like I have control? And what ways can I regain control over my life so that I can stop trying to control things that are not meant for me to control? So again, grief, the fear tactic, it is a heavy, um, it is something that is heavily needed to be addressed. Um, because your story is your story, and can't nobody change that. Can't nobody make it any different. However, it is not your duty or your responsibility to make your story the next person's reality. It is not your responsibility to make your story the next person's reality. Because what a person may be presently experiencing, what a person may be presently going through, is very real for them, and it's very true to them and for them. Just because you had your own personal experience with something that was different than theirs does not mean that your story has to become their reality. That's the message, my beautiful beings. Make sure that if this message touched you, um, feel free to subscribe to the channel, like the page, follow, leave a comment below, and let me know what part of this message spoke to you specifically, if any. But that is the message. Peace and love, my beautiful beings. If you have not already heard it today, you are beautiful, you are amazing, and I love you. Don't stop, don't quit. You the shit. Period.
Don't stop, don't quit, you the shit.
Period.